Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and today we're going to be wrapping up my coverage of the MSI Z390i Gaming Edge AC motherboard. So this adorable ITX thing right here, right? Small. What could possibly go wrong? There's no space for anything on these boards. So yeah, it's $155. MSI loaned the motherboard to me, so it's not like I get to keep it. And I've tested VRM thermals, I've done a bunch of overclocking on it, and we're basically just going to talk about all of that today, because I want to be done with this and move on to doing other stuff. I have a bunch of other Z390 motherboards I need, I should probably test that I need to test as well. So, yeah, anyway, this thing is $155, so I think this is currently the cheapest Z390 motherboard I've worked with. Other than the Z390i Pro Wi-Fi, which is also around that $160 price point. So, yeah, it's cheap, but is it good? Well, let's start off with the VRM thermals, and we're going to have to first talk about the test methodology for that. So, this is the test setup, and the reason why I test open air test bench with a fan on the VRM for ITX is because in the ITX world, there's a lot of very different cases. So to me, it doesn't really make sense to try do like a standardized ITX test build, because ITX is anything but standard. If you look at all of the different cases you can buy, like you can buy like an NZXT Manta, right, which is an ITX case that's almost big enough to house an MATX motherboard. And then you can buy cases that are like basically the size of the board itself, right? Like they're barely bigger than the board. So because there's so much variance in the cases, it just doesn't make sense to me to test in a case when it probably won't even remotely resemble whatever you actually build with an ITX board. And if it's not going to resemble what you're building, then it's not going to have any useful information for you. So I just decided to test a sort of, academic sort of test setup where it's just like, well, it's not even remotely realistic, but it's replicable, and we can still get some data out of it to tell which motherboard has the better VRM cooling solution. So this is the test setup. The actual VRM on this mini ITX motherboard, like the MSI board is VRM wise, I think I mentioned, this is my second take, and my first one was an hour, so I'll probably repeat. Well, I'll screw this one up, but as usual. Anyway, but I have done a PCB breakdown, so if you want details on the VRM, you can go watch that. But the VRM is a 6-phase, as we can see from these incredibly noisy scope shots, and that's just because of the measurement method I used, but we can see each of the individual phases in it, right? So 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So that's our 6-phase VCore VRM running on there. And where this motherboard is kind of special compared to, well, no, not really. No, it is kind of special, is that it decides to basically split the VRM into 2 sections. So you have 3 phases of VCore up here, 3 phases down here. And, those 3 phases get that heatsink. These 3 phases get that heatsink. And essentially, the good thing about doing this is it really spreads the... it reduces the thermal density of the VRM, which makes it significantly easier to cool. And that's actually why when we see the VRM thermal test results for this motherboard, you're going to notice that like this VRM is not significantly more efficient than the other motherboard I tested, which is the Z390i Pro Wi-Fi from Gigabyte. This VRM is not really better from a like the components themselves, not better. They're definitely not better than what the Gigabyte board has. They're significantly better thermally managed. So, MSI is basically like the better heat sinks, as in bigger heat sinks with more surface area, and separating the VRM out like this significantly reduces the thermal density. So basically, MSI has done a great job of the thermal management, as we will soon see. For the actual probe hookup, for the actual probes, so I don't rely on motherboard software temperature readings because a lot of motherboards have god-awful temperature monitoring capabilities, as in they're just wrong a lot of the time. There's a lot of motherboards where you check the temperature in software and the temperature is just like not correct, even remotely. So for that reason, I always also use K-types, and I record both temperature readings. So with this board, we have one K-type jammed down here, and then of course the other one is jammed up in that section of the VRM. So I do have two K-type thermocouples, and I do take measurements from each. And so, yeah, that's kind of that for the thermal testing methodology. Now then, let's take a look at the actual results. And the results, I think, are self-explanatory. Now, first of all, for the V-core and the load line calibration, because I basically can't get the motherboards to properly match up on voltages because the Super I/O chip is not exactly comparable between, like, voltage readings from the Super I/O chip of a motherboard aren't necessarily comparable across motherboards because it depends where that Super I/O chip hooks up to the actual power plane. And basically that means the voltage readings aren't comparable at all. And then also, well, the power planes themselves are going to be different, so that it's not just where the hookup is, it's also like how the power plane is designed. So essentially, using Super I/O voltage readings is just like, that's not going to work. And this board the Gigabyte board does offer voltage readings directly from the IR35201 voltage controller, which are great because they're accurate. They're measured from the CPU. They have 2 millivolts resolution. That's awesome. The MSI board uses a UP9521 voltage controller, which unfortunately doesn't offer any such functionality, which basically means I have no idea what actual V-core this is running. So when I was setting up all of the core voltages here, I'm actually normalizing for power consumption. So I'm aiming to match power consumption and CPU temperatures, not necessarily voltages. And yeah, the ambience here don't line up with the temperatures here, but there was also a slight change to the cooling system for this board. So not the most scientific test method ever. Like, I'm not doing a great job of controlling all of my variables here. But I think I controlled the most important one because electrically these two VRMs are ridiculous. Like, efficiency-wise, these two VRMs should be like right on top of each other. Maybe 1 or 2 watts difference in favor of either one, depending on what specific load scenario you're in. So as long as the sort of input power is matched, they should be outputting basically the same amount of power, which means they should be running roughly the same voltage and roughly the same output current, because I am using the same chip in both cases. So that's kind of the logic behind why these voltages here are higher. This is mode 2 LLC while that's turbo, which is just like, that's a naming convention thing. I don't know what the slopes are for each of these either. Ultimately, I noticed that this MSI board was just pulling less voltage if I matched pulling less power if I matched the voltages properly, and was running significantly cooler. So I basically raised the voltage until the power consumption's matched. So that's kind of the logic behind the CPU configurations. For the workload, I was just running Prime 95 small FFTs non-AVX, and yeah, I mean, even without the AVX, 9900Ks run really hot when you shove a lot of volts into them, right? Like the voltage should be comparable because the power, as I said, like the power consumption's like right on top of each other, but still, that is a lot of volts, and it is very hard to cool. So anyway, what we can still clearly see though from our tests here is that the MSI board just has a far superior VRM cooling system. 1750 RPM, like, it's cooler than the Gigabyte board at 4800 RPM. And that's the same fan on both of them. Like, I did normalize that. So right off the bat, we have a huge advantage in favor of the MSI board at the sort of extreme load scenario. Then when we go down to the more reasonable load scenarios, it's still massively in favor of the MSI board, right? For 283 watts, we're getting lower, like more than 10 degrees lower temperatures, right? And the software readings for both of these boards are accurate, so that's good. But yeah, like MSI boards running less than 10 degrees, more than 10 degrees lower than the Gigabyte board was, and that's with less fan RPM. So it's like, this is better cooled at less fan speed, so this is quieter to run. So essentially, if you want to buy this MSI board and run like a 9900K on it, all you need to do is also buy like a 60 or a 70 or an 80 millimeter fan that goes up to like 2,500 RPM, just in case you're cooling, like just in case, right? Because I did test at a relatively low ambient right here. So if you live somewhere where it gets up to like, I don't know, 40 degrees ambient, yeah, this fan, you're going to need a faster fan. But it still should be viable. Whereas this Gigabyte board, I mean, I'd already say that right there isn't viable just because of how freaking loud it is. So, yeah, that's kind of that. You know, the MSI board just does a way better job of VRM cooling. The only issue with the VRM on the MSI board is that it does thermal throttle at 100 degrees Celsius. So, you know, it starts dropping the CPU clock. If the temperature keeps climbing at 125 degrees Celsius, the VRM, the motherboard will straight up shut down, which is like, that's a perfectly good safety system implementation. The thing is that 100 degrees Celsius throttle is, in my opinion, a little bit aggressive. Like, it's a little bit too early, and it could be later. But nonetheless, like, that's not the worst issue to have as far as I'm concerned. Especially considering that this VRM is actually relatively easy to keep under 100 degrees Celsius anyway. So, yeah, that's kind of that. Like, the MSI board is just better on VRM cooling. And if you're running a 9600K, these are all I can't be bothered tests because it's just like, from the testing I have so far, right, it's so obvious that the MSI board is just better at VRM cooling than the Gigabyte one is, that I just didn't feel like testing any further. So yeah, if you want to run a 9600K, this board's going to be just fine. If you want to run a 9900K, it's still going to be, like, if you want to run a 9700K, it's still going to be mostly fine, right? And if you want to run a 9900K, it's, like, if you just stick to 5 gigahertz, you're still probably going to be fine. So, yeah, MSI's just done like this split heatsink design with the VRM split into two separate sections. It works really, really well. You know, I got to give them that. It does work really, really well, because electrically, right, the VRM between this board and this board are actually really similar. VRM efficiency-wise, very similar. The biggest difference is just MSI's approach to cooling their VRM compared to Gigabyte's. So yeah, that's definitely like, you know, a good result right here for the MSI ITX board. Now, I wish I also knew if, like, how this compares to like the Phantom Gaming from ASRock and the Strix board from Asus, but I've not tested those, so I don't know, and I don't really want to test those either because doing all of the testing for this MSI board actually took forever, and I really don't want to do that again. With, like, well, I want to not do that as much as possible because, yeah, well, VRM thermal testing is boring, and the testing that is interesting, which is all of this stuff right here, takes forever. Like, it takes multiple hours to do quite a few of these, so quite a few of these tests. So, yeah, and I have a massive backlog of GPUs nobody cares about that I want to work on instead. So, yeah. Anyway, like, overall, like, just if we ignore the fact that there's motherboards I haven't tested, I honestly find these results acceptable. Acceptable to the point that I would happily build a daily system with this motherboard. And quite frankly, this isn't bad. I think you could do a hell of a lot worse with even, like, some ATX or MATX boards out there than this right here. So that's kind of that. I think it's kind of a shame that though I do think it's a bit of a shame that MSI decided to target that really low price point of $155. Like, for Z390, $155 is really cheap, right? Like, I think the cheapest Z390 board you can buy is like $100. And once the board is $100, like, that board's awful. Okay, I don't remember what it is, but I remember looking at it and just going like, no, this shouldn't exist. Why did anybody approve the production of this motherboard? I will never understand. But yeah, this is still, like, this is one of the cheapest Z390 boards out there. And, you know, it doesn't do completely awful. So that's quite nice. And the best part is, in this testing right here, it actually does really well, and mostly because this is a mini ITX board. But yeah, basically I did a bunch of memory testing. There's also some CPU testing. I was considering including Cinebench, but then it was just like, oh, do I include the Cinebench scores? And then it's like, oh, then I need to tune the memory settings, and then basically I decided not to bother. Which yeah, like the thing is, there's just so many there's so many complexities with testing motherboards that it's just like for the Geekbench 3 stuff here, this is not auto timings, which I kind of considered doing auto memory timings and doing performance comparisons between the boards, but then I was like, this chart is going to this chart is going to be just pages and pages and pages of memory testing. And probably nobody's going to care that much. And then the auto timings being like, because the thing is just like this board right here has some of the worst, well, actually both of these boards, the Gigabyte boards have some very strange subtiming decisions that occur when you try push very high memory speeds. Now, when you can manually correct all of those timing decisions, but they are strange, and they definitely hurt performance. And so it's just like, I did consider including that, but then I was like, but I don't really want to do that for every board because it's going to take even like for even longer, and it's just going to make a chart that's just endless essentially. So basically everything here is relatively manual, except like these tests right here, which the lazy stands for that I didn't really bother to do. Like I didn't really put a lot of effort into these. So then, let's start going over the results. First of all, 3900 megahertz 1T limit. So basically what this test is I set the command rate to 1T, and I see how high a frequency I can achieve with 1T command rate. Now, this test might not make a lot of sense to anybody, but the idea behind it is there are some motherboards which are just really, really bad. And they're so bad that they will stop doing 1T at like 3600 megahertz. And yeah, that's pretty much the test. That's it. Because the thing is, 1T command rate makes a pretty massive difference to your performance. It makes a pretty massive difference to your overall memory performance, especially if you're on memory that can't clock that high. Essentially that right there is just an easy test to go like, okay, is this motherboard good or bad? And it's just like, well, I would consider 3900 completely average. A good board would be like over 4000 at 1T. A bad board would be like 3600 at 1T. 3900 is right in the middle of that, so I'll say, okay, that's decent. And considering this is a $155 board, you could definitely, like, I'm sure if you bought something else in that price range, you could find a board that doesn't do 1T until doesn't do 1T past 3600. So yeah, that right there, like, it's not a great result, but it's not a terrible result as far as I'm concerned. Then 1T limit dual rank. Now, I don't know what this one's supposed to look like for all of the other boards. It loses to the Z390 Dark, but the Z390 Dark is $500. So, it's just like, yeah, it's kind of a given that the Dark is going to have a better, because I think, like, I'm pretty sure this 1T test is mostly a trace layout test. There's definitely some things you can do with the BIOS, but to a very large extent, this is a test that should be quite memory layout dependent, because I know there was like a bunch of motherboards where it was just like you couldn't do 1T no matter what, and it wasn't fixable with the BIOS. It was just like these motherboards were not designed to run 1T above X frequency. That was the end of the story. There was no way to do 1T above a certain clock. So I consider this basically a motherboard sort of PCB test, whereas just like if you do well in this, then that just shows the board is well designed physically, not necessarily so much a BIOS it's not so much a BIOS test. And anyway, the board does, like, I don't know, that might be okay, it might not be. We'll see when I test some of the other boards. But it does lose to the dark there, but I've not yet tested this. And I have a suspicion that if anything's going to do well at 1T, it's going to be that. Just because Asus seems to put a lot of effort into getting 1T working at quite high frequencies. So, yeah, I expect it to kill it on, like, I expect the gene to kill it on that test and that test. Anyway, then we move on to just maximum frequency on single rank memory sticks, 2 DIMMs. So that's 2 by 8 gigabytes of Samsung B-die right there. Board hits an easy 4800 megahertz. So, you know, that's a pretty good result, I'd say. There's definitely, like, well, I have one motherboard that doesn't do 3600 at 2 DIMMs, single rank megahertz. Doesn't do 3600. So that right there is probably, yeah, that's on the top end of what you can do for, you know, memory frequency. So that's definitely not a bad result. Then we have the 2 DIMMs dual rank. So this is 2 by 16 gigabytes, Samsung B-die. And here the board absolutely freaking kills it. Like, honestly, this right here, this result right here is like so impressive to me that I really want to try talk MSI into letting me keep the board just so I can play with this. This right here, well, more like that right there, is just like, I can't get even close to that on anything else so far. So that just like, and the thing is when I, like, this was the first board I tried that on. So when I saw that on this, you know, on the gaming edge here, I was like, oh my god, imagine what would happen if I tried if I tried dual rank on a real motherboard, right? And so I whacked the memory into the Z390 Dark, and it only did 3866. And my disappointment was immeasurable, and my day was ruined. Quite literally, actually. I was really, really disappointed when I realized that I can't even get, like, even remotely close to that 4300 megahertz that the MSI that the MSI board does so easily. Mind you, that is still a lazy setup, because I got that 4300 basically by accident while going for Geekbench settings. So that was just kind of like, oh yeah, because when I was trying to do it intentionally, it wasn't actually going much further anyway. So I don't know. It seems to be like that might be just the upper limit, and it doesn't seem to really affect timings too much. So yeah, this is super impressive right there. Then we have the dark at 3866, and then the gene is even worse than the dark, which really surprised me, because I was expecting the dark to lose to the gene, because the thing is, the team working on the dark is like the way I explain this to myself is like, well, MSI's been making motherboards for years. Like, well, has been making a lot of motherboards for a very long time. They have a lot of experience with, you know, optimizing their BIOS for various memory configurations. EVGA, not so much. They're a much smaller motherboard vendor than anybody else on this list. And then we have Asus, where it's like, they're huge. So I expected Asus to do about as well as MSI does, but nope, it does even worse. Like, that there is even worse than EVGA. And I honestly think, like, MSI must be using some kind of custom memory training procedure right there, because I'm pretty sure, well, EVGA, as far as I'm aware, is just using the standard sort of Intel memory training configuration, and Asus is probably too, just because they're doing even worse on the frequency than EVGA is. Oops. Breaking my chart. So that's kind of that. And this result right here is super, super impressive to me. Then we have 4 DIMM configurations, which are just not relevant because it's an ITX board, which I should also copy paste for that. And there we go. Then we do the CL12 1T test. So this is like standard extreme overclocking benchmarking settings. Here the board doesn't really do that well, because 1T is limited to 3900. And the board lacks VTT DDR. Again, it's a $155 motherboard that basically I really wish MSI made their own like extreme overclocking motherboard, because I want to see what that would do on a real motherboard. Essentially. But yeah, it lacks VTT-DDR, which is not surprising. It's an ITX board. It just so happens to be really good at memory overclocking. But it's not designed to be some crazy extreme overclocking board. It's an ITX board for, ITX people who want i5s and maybe i7s. I mean, the fact that it even handles the 9900K without too much complaining is kind of impressive. Especially it's like $155. So yeah, the lack of VTT DDR, not surprising at all, but it does mean that basically with my memory collection, it's basically impossible to go above 3900 megahertz at CL12. So that's kind of where that, stops right there. So normally, like good boards, you want to be doing over 4,000. Honestly, with these settings, you want to be doing over 4,000. The Dark does that. The Gene does that. The MSI doesn't. It's really that simple. So yeah, but that's not a disappointing result. Honestly, that's just kind of like, well, it's not an extreme overclocking board. I'm not sure why you'd expect it to do extreme overclocking settings. Then we have Geekbench 3 Core Clock. And there we go to 5.25 gigahertz, and this is unlimited voltage. Basically, I will raise the core voltage until the CPU stops scaling, and so I do believe this was set at like 1.45 volts or something, like some pretty insane voltage. And same for the Z390 Dark. So this is supposed to be basically a test of like VRM quality, because the idea is if we just, focus on the fact that we're cooling limited, whichever board hits the highest clock speed is going to have have the best VRM. And I'm pretty sure that at least at ambient, the upper limit for my CPU is probably 5.25 gigahertz. So if you do 5.25, you have a good board, basically. Because honestly, like even with 1.47, I think I even went all the way up to like 1.5 volts. Even at 1.5 volts, the chip would not do even 20 megahertz more, because at that point it was just getting too hot. So yeah, this is a perfectly good result, and it's not really surprising. I mean, the board has a 6-phase V-core VRM. Like that's a good that's a good number of phases. It has a decent switching frequency, right? It runs at 400 kilohertz. And actually for that test, I do believe I set it to the highest frequency setting, which turns out to be something like, I want to say it's over 500 kilohertz on the oscilloscope. So, it has the VRM does a decent job of output regulation. It just runs really hot because it's kind of small and crammed onto an ITX motherboard. So yeah, that's what that result shows. It'll be interesting to see what the Gene does, because that one kind of has the most unique VRM out there. Gigabyte board, I think, tops out around the same, but I'll have to add that to the test results. Anyway, like this is not a VRM thermal test. This is like a output regulation test, and I don't really expect to see too many differences here at ambient. Maybe on liquid nitrogen you might start seeing some bigger differences, but ambient, yeah, I expect any board with like 4 phases to probably do 5.25 gigahertz. And then if you have less than 4 phases, you might start losing frequency. So that's kind of my expectations for this test. Anyway, moving on higher, we have next Max Geekbench 3 single rank memory score. And here, this is like this small difference right here is actually that's actually kind of significant. The Dark does set a lot of its sub timings better than the MSI board does. So the Dark is just better at for a given memory, for a given memory configuration, the Dark does better than the MSI board. But still, this is an impressive result. 47 CL15. That's pretty much that's basically the limit of my CPU's memory controller as far as I can tell. And MSI just seems to have their BIOS tuned more for raw frequency than absolute performance, which is probably why we're seeing that small performance gap right there. And the thing is, I didn't really spend too much time dialing this in, whereas I think I spent more time dialing that in. So there's a good chance this could probably go faster. Anyway, so yeah, that's still I'd consider that a good result. right? That's an impressive frequency, decent timings, decent score. And then I tested dual rank. And this is why I really wanted dual rank to work on the dark, because damn. Right? Like it scores way better. Oops. And yeah, we can do 4300 megahertz CL14, and I was like, well, if we could do 4400 like 4400 CL14 or something like that, you know, with like all tightened up subtimings and just everything nailed with, because the thing is, I don't have VTT DDR on this board, so it's like I can't really push on, like I'd want to go to higher memory voltages to try push even more extreme settings. I just can't. And the thing is, yeah, I was like, oh yeah, we need to do that on the dark, and then it's like, oh no, you can't. It doesn't work. And so because of that, like, because this board does so well with dual rank, it actually scores better with dual rank than on single rank. But the dark, just because it sets all of its subtimings better, overall actually wins Geekbench by a little bit. So yeah, I'm pretty sure with some more fine tuning, I can actually get the dark to break 4.3K. The issue is I really did spend way more time working with this board than on the dark, because essentially what happened is, like, I finished my, like, I really wanted to get this stuff done and out of the way with this board and then move on to the other boards. And so the dark was kind of the next board I tested, because I wanted to run it on liquid nitrogen, and I was like, I want to do a quick pre-test of dual rank and single rank, like just get a feel for overclocking my 9900K on the board before taking the motherboard on LN2. And yeah, that's kind of where I topped out. Which, considering that was in a rush, that's a great result. It's probably going to get higher as I fill this chart in. So, yeah. But still, the MSI board there, you know, it does well enough as far as I'm concerned. And then when it comes to memory voltage, there's no weird issues with voltage regulation, like voltage settings. So 1.5 volts gives you 1.5 volts, 2.1 volts gives you 2.1 volts. So that's all as expected. Then we have an IDA64 latency test. So this is basically a test for these settings right here, because that's actually, like, those timings are like those are latency optimized. This stuff right here is bandwidth optimized. This stuff right here would be bandwidth optimized as well, except I've not added these because it's like, I was like, wait, what? It only does 3866? I'm not even bothering to test that then. I will eventually add it, but yeah, so this right here is supposed to be bandwidth focused. And so, you know, this being the latency test, that's the one I run for IDA64 at 32.2 nanoseconds is right around what you'd expect for that frequency and those timings, right? I think I think on the Gene and Dark, I should be able to hit like 31 something. So yeah. And then my only other complaints for the board are it only has Super IO voltage monitoring, and it needs a bit of memory training sometimes. So basically what I mean by that is sometimes you need to boot like 3600 megahertz and then you can run 3900, which actually, like, yeah, like for this to work, you need to boot at 3600 first and then go to 3900. You can't just go straight to 3900 at CL12. And I think this right here has the same issue, where it's like you have to do 4000 or something like that. Like, you need to do something a couple hundred megahertz lower first. The board will figure out how to, like, set its auto timings, and then you can go to the full speed. And yeah, on dual rank, this MSI board is absolutely incredible. Everywhere else, it's just kind of, it's not bad, but I wouldn't say it's incredible. And because it lacks VTT DDR, and, you know, there's no postcode, there's no buttons. Like, I wouldn't consider this an extreme overclocking motherboard by any stretch. It is, like, for considering it's $155, I like, at this price point, it's probably one of the best memory overclocking motherboards out there. Okay, like, if you're buying a motherboard under $200, I think the only other boards that even have a chance to compare to this is going to be the Strix from Asus, which, considering that the Gene doesn't do a great job with 32 gigs of RAM, I have serious doubts that the Strix ITX board would be any better, just because, like, I don't think this right here is a indicator of, like, board design. I think that's an indicator of mostly, like, BIOS optimizations. And MSI seems to have actually like nailed them, and everybody doesn't. And well, I don't think Asus cares, and EVGA hasn't had time to work on that yet. They are working on that, so who knows? We might see this number go way up. So, yeah, I don't know about ASRock, but Asus doesn't seem to care too much about 32, like running two 16 gig DIMMs at very high speeds. So it's kind of that. So yeah, for a daily system, I mean, if you want to buy it, sure. I don't see a problem with running this board daily. I'm not certain that it's maybe I'm not sure that it would be the best choice for a 9900K. It might be the best choice for 32 gigs of RAM though, right? Again, because like that there, like that's seriously impressive. Actually, I have an image of that score right here. And this is not even like full, like these timings aren't perfect even. Like, I'm not sure that that could go lower, but maybe. And yeah, the RTLs and IOLs on this board are really, really loose at that point, but still, like this is seriously impressive. Like, I never thought this would work, but it did. And yeah, so for 32 gigs of memory, so if you wanted to run like an ITX workstation, I guess, this might be a really good option. If you want to run a 9900, like, yeah, 9900K for a workstation. So that's kind of the issue, is just like the VRM isn't quite on par with the memory overclocking prowess of this motherboard. And, you know, at this price point, I feel like most people probably don't want to be splurging 300-ish dollars, or well, actually way more than $300, like over $400 for 32 gigs of B die. So, you know, that is kind of not ideal. So it's like, but still, I think it's really cool that this motherboard is so damn good at memory overclocking considering the price point. The VRM thermals are acceptable as far as I'm concerned. They're not disasters. You know, so yeah, it's just that this is definitely like, this is not a motherboard I would benchmark with, like I would try to do extreme overclocking on, just because of like there's that, right? Like that's a problem. Then the fact that the VRM is only a 6-phase, that just wouldn't fly on liquid nitrogen. It's fine on ambient, and just not on liquid nitrogen. There's no way that's going to ever work out. Actually, no, it might work out, but for only like short benchmarks and barely. So, yeah, it's just like it's a it's an interesting little motherboard. I think if you're a massive memory overclocking nerd, buy one just because it's so damn cheap and it can do some kind of crazy things. It is also worth noting that MSI actually holds the world record for memory frequency on this motherboard, which I'm kind of suck at memory overclocking, so I'm not gonna say if like that's because MSI did something incredible, or because MSI just put more effort into taking the memory frequency record than everybody else, because that sometimes happens where it's just like, you know, some board vendor just doesn't bother with trying to do something, and it's like, you know, if you're the only contestant in the race, it's kind of easy to be first. So that's kind of that. But yeah, the board's definitely very, very good at doing interesting things with memory. It's just not necessarily what I would consider competitive. Okay, just because, you know, VTTDDR, so if you have some pickier B die, it won't work properly. You know, there's just all kinds of just what I would consider minor issues. It's just interesting to play with. And for a daily system, that doesn't really matter, right? Everything I've just pointed out with like, oh, the memory overclock, like it's great memory overclocking. It's just not the very best memory overclocking. Doesn't really matter for a daily system. For a daily system, this is like, yeah, for a 9600K or a 9700K, if you want to build an ITX rig, this is a really, like, it's a solid option. I'm not sure that it's the best because I haven't tested all of the ITX boards, but it's definitely solid. It could be a lot worse. And memory overclocking wise, like if you want to run 32 gigs, this really might be the best board just out of everything. So Yeah, props to MSI on that crazy memory overclocking capability right there. Like, just like, because after seeing that, is like even I'm having a hard time believing that this board does that, but no, it does it. Like it says right there, it freaking does it, right? So yeah, um, the MSI Z390i Gaming Edge AC, randomly very good at memory overclocking for like weird memory setups. Um, but yeah, I mean, this is a this is a impressive little motherboard. I really wish they made a extreme like an MATX board, which was basically this board, just bigger VRM and post codes and buttons. Right? Like that's it. That's all I want. Is just an extended version for extreme overclocking because yeah, this thing it did quite like impress me quite a bit. And I guess also like I think honestly MSI could have done a better job with the like component wise. They could have gone for a better VRM. Like they totally could have done an IR35201 and they could have gone for like 60 amp power stages or something. The thing is, doing all of those things would probably put this motherboard at like $200 instead of $155, and it wouldn't actually change anything else. Just like it would only change the V-Core VRM. So yeah, I'm not sure. Like, well, yeah, that's just some of my random thoughts on that. Anyway, let's wrap this video up because it is 40 minutes at this point. Um, So, yeah, I mean, I've basically said everything I want to say. I'll let you draw your own conclusion. I think I've made my viewpoint perfectly clear, right? Not a bad board. Does need active VRM cooling to run a 9900K maxed out. Crazy, like, impressive memory overclocking capability, especially considering the price point. So, yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching. Like, share, subscribe, leave any comments, questions, suggestions down in the comments section below. And if you'd like to support what I do here with actually hardcore overclocking, I have a Patreon and there's a bunch of merch on Teespring. You can find links to both down below. Those help out immensely with running the channel. And yeah, I think that's it. So I think I'll just hit the stop button, right? I've not forgotten anything. See ya.